I'd like to welcome all of you to our final presentation before the Conservation Commission and the Planning Board for our Town of Hingham Climate Change Vulnerability Risk Assessment and Adaptation Study. For folks who don't know me, I am the Conservation Officer for the Town of Hingham. My name is Abby Pearsall, and I am not going to spend a whole lot of time speaking tonight. Rather, I am going to turn it over to our consultant, Andre Martecchini, and he is going to give you the summary of past exploration findings and recommendations for the Town of Hingham relative to some of the results of our study.
Thank you, Abby. So, we have a lot to cover. The steering committee asked me to kind of give an overview because not everyone has heard the various presentations that we've made in the past. So I'm going to give a little bit an overview of some of the methodologies that we looked at, review some of the actual modeling results. Then we'll look at some of the vulnerability assessments. In other words, we did some ranking of your various infrastructure assets. We did a few photo renderings, which are kind of interesting to see what potential flooding, and I stress potential, but what potential flooding scenarios might look like in some spots. We'll talk a little bit about natural resources and how they might evolve over time, and adaptation strategies and costs, and a little bit of your reviews of policies and some of your regulations. So first of all, in terms of the basic model that we did was part of a modeling system that was done for Mass DOT, Massachusetts Department of Transportation, for the Central Artery. And you all know that Central Artery has lots of tunnels, and Mass DOT is very worried about those tunnels flooding. So they undertook a study. Hingham happens to be down on the bottom there with the arrow. It happens to be within that model area. So it worked out very well to use that modeling. And it takes into account all kinds of things. One of them is sea level rise. So there are a number of different curves, and I don't want to get into a lot of the discussion of why because we just don't have time, but suffice it to say that the curve that we ended up using for this study is what's called the highest potential curve for sea level rise. What it turns out, what it practically means that in 2030, we're looking at about a 0.66 feet of total sea level rise. And in 2070, which is our other future outlier year, we're looking at about 3.9 feet. So it's a lot of, and again, we're basically looking at the present, 2030, and 2070. So some of the modeling results. First of all, we did a couple of maps that are called basically the risk of flooding maps. So in the risk of flooding maps, the code is, this projector I think is a little skewed here. There's a color code here that's cut off that gives you a key. Let me see if it's, no, it doesn't. Okay. So in any case, the darker the colors, the deeper, the higher the percent risk that these areas are going to flood. We're not going to concentrate on that much. All of these are cut off here, unfortunately. Okay, so sea level rise in 2030. Again, this is basically looking at depths of water. And again, the bluer, the darker the water, the more potential sea level rise there is. This is for sea level rise alone. Sorry, this is only sea level rise. Does not include storm surge. So you can see, for instance, in Broad Cove, there's some areas there. There's a little bit of along the Inner Harbor. As you get into the 2070, this is sea level rise. This is what you're going to see twice a day. Again, it gets a little bit deeper in the Broad Cove area. You can't see too well on this scale of map, but suffice it to say that the sea level rise alone is not a major issue for the town of Hingham. Other towns it is, but for the town of Hingham it's not a huge issue. So now we go to the combined sea level rise and storm surge. So in 2030, what we're looking at, we have probabilities for a whole different number of probabilities. For presentation purposes, we're focusing on two numbers, the 1% probability of these events occurring, and at the 0.2%. Now, the 1% is 1 in 100. That's what 1% is. It's equivalent to that kind of 100-year storm that we're all sort of, when you think of FEMA flood maps and things, you think of that 100-year storm. That's, in essence, what this is sort of equivalent to. And when you look at this, you can see, again, areas that are subject to flooding. When you look in 2030 at the 0.2%, that's a rarer, it's less probable. So it's a 500-year occurrence event in 2030. And if I just toggle back a little, you can see that the area in the downtown area is pink now, which is like, if you looked on the scale here, it would be half a foot. As you get into the yellows, it's more like the foot, maybe a foot and a half in some areas. So as we get into 2030, now if we go to 2070, now we're getting 55 years out, you get deeper. And what we're noticing, there are two main paths where the water starts to enter into the downtown area, as well as overtopping Route 3A at Broad Cove Culvert and coming up that area. There's also, I'll get into a few little more detailed areas where we blow it up a little that you can see a little bit better. And again, this is 2070 at the 500-year event. So because those big town-wide maps are kind of hard to focus in on, so we're focused in a few areas. So one of the areas where we're noticing some flooding is sort of what we're calling the Hingham-Hull connectors, George Washington and Rockland. And so you can see this is for present, and if you go to 2030, and if you go to 2070, so you can start seeing how the ones on the left are 1%, the ones on the right are at 0.2. So I'll go back. So you start to see how today this is your areas where there's some flooding potential. It gets a little bit wider, a little bit greener, yellower, and in some case bluer. And when you get to 2070, it's the same general area, which is good. That what it's not doing in some towns, when you all of a sudden reach a certain threshold and it floods an entire different area of the town that you aren't expecting anything. So you're basically staying within those zones that are currently somewhat subject to flooding. If we look at the inner harbor area, again, this is present day, and you can see the pink areas around the bathing beach. That's sort of 6-inch kind of depth of water. The Whitney Wharf, by the way, you're going to see this throughout. It's in the wrong spot. It's supposed to be over there, so don't worry about that. But anyway, so you can see this. This is for present day. It gets a little yellower, a little deeper, and as you get into 2070, now we're talking. Some areas back where it says Mill Street Pump Station is in the order, 4 or 5 feet of water potential. And this is for let's say on the right side is a 500-year storm in 2070. So certainly, as we look forward for 2070, that's somewhat of a long way off, but still this is. So another area that we sort of focused a little bit on was the Foster Elementary in Broad Cove. You have the Foster Elementary School up in the upper right corner, and then there's the Broad Cove Sewer Pump Station down sort of a little bit lower. And so, again, if you look at 2030, it's one thing if you add 2070 in there, it's starting to expand that flood zone. So that's sort of a snapshot. I mean, we have more slides, but just in the interest of trying to just kind of put an overview of what we were finding. So are there any questions? Because by the way, I don't mind answering questions along the way. I have a lot to cover. So if it looks like it's going to bog us down, if anybody has questions, please, yeah. The whole model, the model, the way it's set up, and I have some slides, but basically there are probably several hundred storm events that are modeled, and the model goes all the way down into the Gulf of Mexico, into the Caribbean, and it models the storm tracks, it models hurricanes, it models nor'easters, it takes into account tide levels. So, in other words, here in the Northeast, we have a lot more probability that you're going to get a nor'easter, right, than a hurricane. The hurricane is much worse, usually. I mean, if we get a direct hit, it'll be a worse experience. It's a shorter duration, so the chances of that hurricane hitting at a high tide has less probability, say, than the nor'easter hitting at a high tide, because the high tide can run over several cycles with a nor'easter. So the model sort of takes into account probabilities. Can it happen more? Of course, it can. And as we've seen, sometimes the 100-year storms do occur more than once in 100 years.
When you overlay these depths, what's the duration of saturation? Is this just for the length of the storm?
Well,
Is it length of the tides?
oh, I'm sorry. Okay, yeah. The question was, because we're recording this, the question asked was, what's the duration of time that these events occur? That's a good question. The model can actually do that. We did not focus in on this because it's just beyond the scope of the study. But suffice it to say, in this general Boston Harbor region, where we have a 9-foot tide, give or take, somewhere it's a good amount of tide. If we have a 5-foot storm surge coming in, when that storm passes and the tide starts to go down, it recedes pretty quickly. Now, in an area like this, in Broad Cove, where you have a culvert currently that sort of is a restriction, and if you've overtopped, it may take a longer duration than just a tide cycle to actually empty that bay, that cove. And so it can be done. We did not look at it in this.
I mean, a 5-foot depth at a duration of a day basically renders these areas inhabitable.
Exactly. Yeah, a 5-foot depth over a course of a day. Yes, that's exactly right. So, okay, I'm going to move on. So, part of what we got some modeling results, and now we said, all right, what do you do with this? So, we wanted to look at your vulnerable infrastructure and kind of come up with a way to sort of look at vulnerability, and we're looking at it in terms using the concept of risk. And so what is risk? Risk, in this context, is the probability of the event occurring, so the probability of flooding, times the consequence. Because it's great to know probability. A model tells you the probability, but so what? So if a road floods, big deal, maybe. If your police station floods, I know it won't, if your police station floods, it's a big deal. Or if your a sewer plant floods, it's a big deal. So in what we're taking into account here is the concept of risk. So how do we get probabilities? The probabilities come from the model. And the model is basically this big mesh of nodes. And every node has basically information on it. And one of the pieces of information is called the probability of exceedance. So on the left here, there's the probabilities, 0.1%, 0.2%, all the way down to 100% probability. And so for the different years, there's the present, 2030, 2070, there's a flood elevation associated with that risk. So if you look at this for Mill Street Pump Station, under present day, it's saying that it's always going to be dry. It's not going to get water because it's not low enough. In 2030, however, that the critical elevation of the pump station is 8.69. That occurs when the 9.3 there at 5%. There's a 5% probability in 2030 that that's going to be exceeded, and so on in 50% probability in 2070 that critical elevation is going to be exceeded. So that's our probability part of the equation. Consequence is a lot more subjective. We've come up with a rating system, and I'm not going to get into all the details, but basically there are 6 categories that we sort of did a qualitative evaluation of. The area of service loss. In other words, if this asset fails due to flooding, is it going to affect just a little neighborhood, or is it going to affect the entire town? Duration of service loss. Is it going to be a long-term outage or a short-term? Cost of damage, the impact on public safety and emergency services, impacts on important economic activities, and then impacts on public health. And these are sort of general ways to look at consequence, in other words, the impacts of the failure. From that, we can rate so using the Mill Street pump station, we came up with a rating system. You normalize it to a score at the end, and it basically, for this one, it's a 63 was the consequence score. Again, I can't get into the details of everything, but I'm just trying to show you the example of how we go through here. So consequence score of 63. So then we're looking at the actual calculation of risk. And again, remember, it's very simple. Risk is probability times consequence. But we can do it for the present day, we can do it for 2030, and we can do it for 2070. And then we also can weight it, because something that's flooding today, I think, should have more weight in terms of you having to deal with it than something that starts flooding in 2070. So the concept is that the risk numbers that generated for for present day got a 50% rating weighting. For 2030 it was 30%, and 2070 has the least amount of sort of, if you're looking at a composite score. And so if we look at that example of the Mill Street pump station, you have the consequence score, the 63, that stays constant. It's always the same consequence, unless you do something along the way to change it, make it more redundant or whatever. The probabilities, the 0, 5, and 50 for the 3 years, you multiply it out, you apply your weights, it has a composite score of 728. So, and what we're doing is then ranking those various composite scores and then comparing them and seeing where do they fall out. And it's a way to kind of look at the sort of the criticality or the importance of various assets. I know you can't read it, it's in the report, but basically what we did then in the report, we've presented sort of the top 20, because the reality is you probably will be dealing with, if you can solve your top 20 problems, you'll be going a long, long way to, solving or dealing with sea level rise. We have certainly the data for everything, but so we're presenting top 20. And what we find is, if we rank it by composite risk score, what we find is the reality is that most of the problems seem to be roads and seawall related work, assets. And some of the facilities, like in the middle, here's the Foster Elementary School, and we have a pump station, West Corner Pump Station, and so on. So the for this ranking, it's ending up that the focus could be on the walls and roadways. So we talked about some photo renderings. These are some actual photos that we took, that were taken, and we're now superimposing, and this is fairly realistic in terms of taking the water elevation. In this case, this is looking at Broad Cove as you're kind of rounding towards going, I guess, north, and Broad Cove on the left. And this is looking at that area in 2030 with an elevation of predicted water at around 10 feet. Now this is NAVD 88. So you may be talking in different datums. Sometimes you're hearing different. This whole study was done in this datum. So sometimes you may not relate to the numbers. You have to think of what datum you're used to looking at. Anyway, so this is for 2030 at Broad Cove, and you can see it's just overtopping. I mean, it's overtopping the road at that point. If you go to the exact same photo, now in 2070 at a 12.8 foot elevation, it becomes obviously much more dramatic. This is Route 3A from looking from North Street to Water Street, down again in the Inner Harbor area. This is 2030 with a 10-foot elevation, and this is 2070 with another 2.8 feet more water. So this is what you start to look at and say, now, how do we deal with this? And do we deal with it? I mean, that's, I think, going to be a lot of what you as the town have to now wrestle with is, how do you potentially deal with this, if at all? This is George Washington Boulevard, going, I believe, looking towards Hull. And again, this is for 12.8 feet. For 2070, for 2030, actually it was dry. So we don't have a photo for that. So any questions on anything so far? I'm kind of going through quickly so we can maybe have some discussion later.
One
Yep.
question is the lateral effect of that 12-foot flood on storm drains means that flood elevation affects the invert much farther upstream.
Right. The question, or more an observation, is that by having this water flooding over everything, it does affect the storm drainage system very much so. So even areas that are not flooded, and when this occurs, this is very likely occurring at the same time that you have a pretty good deluge going on with rain. This model, by the way, that's one of the limitations of this whole model. It does not include precipitation, additional precipitation from overland flow and rivers and things like that. Now, the reality is that when the ocean floods, it gets its elevation. Everything else just doesn't make any real difference, except if you're right in a river area where you get a little bit of extra bump potentially. So in this case, you're right.
Are these all at the peak of the tide?
Well, no, not necessarily. The question is, are these, and when we're talking about 2030, these are not necessarily at the peak of the tide. This is a water elevation that has a 1% probability of occurring. This could be a mean tide with a Category 5 hurricane hitting, probably pretty low probability, but that could happen, versus a nor'easter at an astronomical tide, maybe the same probability. And so it's that combination. It's a probability of that event occurring. It's not saying, we have done, for instance, when we did the Marshfield, Duxbury, and Scituate model that we did there, we used a different technique, and there we had to sort of pick. We said a Category 2 occurring at mean high water. It was a little different. It wasn't a probabilistic model. This is probability based.
So it's not the worst case?
It is not necessarily the worst. So that's and the point you just made was, this is not a worst case model, and that is a very correct observation. If we use the model SLOSH, for example, what we do is in essence get the maximum of the maximums. In other words, that's your worst case. That's okay if you want to do some ultimate planning. Maybe if you're the Pilgrim Nuclear Power Plant, maybe you want to do the worst of the worst. If you're planning for actual events to occur, you probably don't want to plan for that super worst case, because you're going to spend a lot of money to get there and even to get here. So this is, we call this the worst of the most likely cases. So, okay, let's move on. Oops, wrong way. So, natural resources, Conservation Commission, you may be interested a little bit. The Woods Hole Group, our subconsultant, who, by the way, did the modeling for this as well as the marsh migration studies, use a software called SLAM, a nickname for sea level affecting marsh migration. It takes LiDAR topography, the basic survey information that's available from MassGIS. It starts with some wetland layers that were classified by this NWI, the National Wetland Inventory. It starts with a 2011 survey. So it may not agree with what you currently think your wetlands are, but this is what NWI classified in 2011 for the town of Hingham. So that's our basis. Then what we run is the model takes into account sea level rise only. So the bottom one there says storm surge is not included. Because marsh and sort of this natural resource, yes, it can have erosion that could occur during a big storm, but the real sort of change in natural resources is a cumulative effect of sea level rise. And so as if your accretion rate of a marsh is not able to what's the word? Keep up. There it goes. That's what I'm trying to. If it can't keep up with the sea level rise, so in other words, your marsh is naturally, as plants die and debris comes in, it's building up. But if the sea level is going faster, then you're going to get a very changing marsh condition. And so this model is looking at how this might change. So starting in 2011, and again, this is very difficult to see on a big picture, but so starting in 2011, so if we look at the Broad Cove area, I don't have a pointer, unfortunately, but over here is an example here, and downtown area here. So if you look at those two areas, it's cut off on the bottom too, the key. You can see those areas in 2011. This is what was classified by the National Wetlands Inventory. So in 2030, you can start seeing changes, say, in Broad Cove, where it's going more into a flooded marsh as opposed to like a transitional type marsh. And as you go into 2070, that same area, now you can start to see it grow. Now, this model does not take into account, in other words, if there is and we ran into this in Gloucester as an example, where we did this and part of it is in the Inner Harbor area. It shows the marsh migrating into, in the Inner Harbor industrial zone. Obviously, that's not going to occur because it's in an industrial zone. The model does not take into account impervious surfaces. It can, but in the study that was done, this is part of a statewide study. So as part of that study, it didn't take into account. So if you have a roadway adjacent to the marsh and you maintain that roadway, you are not going to get that encroachment. And so that could be refined a little bit further. But it's basically showing when this is all said and done, there's a lot of transition from sort of high-level marsh, which goes to more low, more flooded marsh, and in some cases, some of the low marsh becomes tidal flat, and some of the upland area is transitioning into marsh. So it's some of it's good, and because transition in this sense is not necessarily a bad thing. It can have different ecological. So it's something that this is what could potentially occur. So just summarizing them, in 2011, basically from now to 2030, there's an approximate 13 acres of high marsh loss going basically to low marsh. There's approximately 10 to 30 acres of upland area that could be lost if impervious surfaces were not allowed, allowing it to move. if there could be a loss of about 28 acres of transitional marsh, which is very kind of sporadic, to high marsh. And again, you're gaining then, therefore, 28 acres of low marsh and 25 acres of tidal flats. And again, some good things, some bad things, potentially. And again, if you look out for 27, it's something similar. And you're losing 98 acres of high marsh, a loss of approximately 70 to 100 acres of upland, loss of approximately 26 acres of beach, and increasing the widths in tidal creeks, gaining approximately 100 acres of low marsh, and gain approximately 32 acres, especially in Broad Cove, and so on. So the report has a little bit more information on this, but this is the natural resources. So, adaptation strategies. Let me just see how I'm doing on time here. Okay, time. Adaptation strategies, we'll talk a little bit about that. So we'll focus in a few areas here. We have roadways, so that whole inner harbor area. There's sort of a couple of different sections. If you look, the Broad Cove area is up in the sort of the upper area there, the DE areas. The H area and is, I forget the name of the marsh going through there. And then the two spots that we saw that are kind of the O, what is it? An O and the L areas are where you're getting water coming into the downtown commercial area. So this table is showing, how much in long-term potential raising you need to do to basically stop that. And so, without getting into, you can do combinations of things. You can, for instance, if you were to look at raising seawalls and basically raising the barrier that's against the sea, there's probably somewhere in the order of magnitude of 5,000 linear feet of seawalls, excluding Kimball's Wharf, which is about 450, which is privately owned. So you pretty much have control of most of the rest. So assuming a cost, and please keep in mind these costs are sort of big picture planning numbers. They're don't imply that you're going to go out and build them for this cost. These are not project costs, but in the $5 to $15 million range just to raise some of those seawalls to the heights, and an additional it of course makes no sense to do your seawalls and not to do the private one. So you kind of have to look at this as a whole project. The other concept is to look at, for instance, Route 3A. So Route 3A is a corridor that comes through, and if you raise it, you can do combinations of raising the roadway, maybe in the shorter term, up to elevation, say 10.2, which is sort of that 0.2%, the 500-year number, or a little bit less if you go to the 1% number. But you could raise the roadway maybe 2 feet, foot and a half, something, depending on where the roadway is. And then in the future, because first of all, keep in mind, there is no guarantee that the predictions that we make are going to come true. All right, and I'm not going to, it's based on a curve for sea level rise that is the best science available today. The science is evolving tremendously. So 10 years from now, you may have a completely different set of curves. It may be much higher, it may be much lower based on actual observed data. So, yes?
Assuming this scenario you've just given us, whether it's seawall or highway or both, do we then end up becoming a Holland with a berm seacoast and a lower inland?
It may. The question is, if you basically raise this area, whichever combination that you choose, do you become a Holland with a berm along? Yes. I mean, that is in essence. If you're going to try and protect your downtown area from the effects of flooding coming in and your infrastructure, your Mill Street pump station and such, if that's your goal, then yes, you have to stop the water. Now, what I would suggest is you don't have to necessarily go and build all the way up to elevation 14 now. And I would not recommend you actually do that. You may do an incremental approach so that anything that you do, so for instance, if you're going to build raised seawalls, think in terms of modularity. Don't build something that if you have to raise it 5 feet in the future, it has to be torn out and rebuilt. You want to build so that maybe you only build up to this height, but you can just very easily add that extra feet because the rest of the structure is already designed for that. So that's how I would approach this. You don't want to, first of all, you can't spend the money. I mean, you're not going to have the money to spend it, number one. Nor should you, because you don't know if by 2070 is so far out, it's very difficult to predict, will it actually occur? When you think of flood walls, certainly there are green berms, and you actually have space along the corridor where you could do some nice, landscape berms, maybe with a sidewalk on top or benches or whatever. That's a whole planning landscape type project. If you're looking at harder flood walls, there, for instance, on the upper right, you have the idea of possibly a glass wall. If it has to be that tall, and it maybe doesn't have to be that tall, but if it does, this is a glass wall. On the bottom is the concept that, for instance, you have access that at some point you're going to have to get through to your bathing beach, to the town dock, to some of the Kimball's Wharf on a day-to-day basis when there's no flooding. But when there is flooding, you can have openings that you drop in panels or drop in or close gates. So that's the concept that you have to allow for some pass-throughs here. Similarly, if we were to look at George Washington Boulevard and Rockland Street getting into Hull, again, there are certain places where we're experiencing some flooding. And again, it's not necessarily, you don't have to, one concept, it's not a strategy in a sense, but the reality is if you do nothing, the road floods. And especially on some of Rockland Street, for example, it may flood, it may be impassable for a period of time, but as long as maybe the people in Hull have at least one means to get out of Hull from a safety point of view, then maybe you don't do anything. And that's the strategy, that you let it flood. So if we look at George Washington Boulevard, there are about 850 feet to raise it to about elevation 10.2. Not overly huge cost. If you're to add some barriers to get it up to 14, it's another $1 million+ for 2,000 feet of barriers. For Rockland Street, now this is a bigger one. This has a lot of low flat area, 6,000 feet. Now you're talking a lot of cost raising. And frankly, I think there's relatively limited amount of density along the road. So maybe this is not where you're going to want to spend your money. At the Foster Elementary School, that's on Broad Cove. So in 2030, the potential is there that water gets up that far. It also will depend on, there's some talk that you may be looking at doing some kind of a culvert project at even independent of sea level rise to help improve the tidal flow into and out of the cove. Well, that's good. It'll help you with your natural resources, but it also has the effect of raising, because right now, because of that small constriction, you don't allow water to pass through, and so if you have a 9-foot tide out here, you have I think if I remember, 3.5, 4-foot tide on the inside. So it attenuates that tide. If you open that widening, you can get much better flow through, but you also get more now water coming in. So depending on what you do there, 2030 with the current system, with a series of relatively small, because there's an area below the first floor of the school. The first floor is okay. It's the area below the first floor that has some mechanical, electrical equipment that you need to prevent water from getting into that crawl space area. So a relatively modest amount. In 2070, to really stop the water, you're talking about probably some kind of flood berm protection system. You know, $820,000. You know, it's a lot of money. By 2070, you're probably looking at a new school anyway. So you know, make sure that when you either locate it at a different place or build it at a higher elevation, and I'm sure you'll take care of that probably by then in 55 years. So here is just illustrating. So there's some doors that you can put in some drop-in panels. There's a stairwell going down into that area with the electric equipment. So you can put some barriers around the louvers and things. And you know, looking at in the future, you know, if you're thinking to try to retain the water without, you know, raising, it could also do a lot of parking lot regrading and things like that. But I mean, I think by the time this is occurring, the reality is you'll be looking at a relatively new school or major reconstruction project of some sort for the building. Mill Street Pump Station, that's your pump station. And it's, again, here, this is a small enough facility that this might be okay to actually use a temporary flood barrier and seal the, you know, electric conduits coming in, so that even if you put a barrier around, you got to make sure that water doesn't seep up from conduits and things. So to look at, you know, you could do some waterproofing here for a relatively modest sum of money. And so these are some kind of these deployable type barriers that, you know, you could store them somewhere. When a big, you know, catastrophic storm is coming, you basically come in, you set these up. A crew can do this relatively quickly, and basically it's a temporary barrier. And then when the storm goes, you take it away and put it away in storage again. By the way, this is also for homeowners that might, you know, have problems. That's another idea for you might explore. And again, you have two other pump stations that are susceptible. Again, relatively easy. These are basically kind of just standalone little projects. The other thing that we're recommending is that you install a tide gauge in your harbor, because right now the only tide information we really have is Boston Harbor. It's good information, a long history back to the 1921, I think. But as you go forward, start accumulating your own data. It's relatively cheap to put in these days, like $5,000 or something. So the last sort of group that I'd just like to talk about a little bit is some changes to policies and regulations. So the planning board, the conservation commission, the zoning board, you all deal with policies and regulations. You make applicants submit things. So there's some housekeeping things. I'm not going to get into the first couple, but under your notice of intent process, I think it's important to now, when you have a notice of intent, especially in a flood district, an area that's susceptible to coastal flooding, is to require applicants to submit a discussion on the effects of sea level rise and how are you dealing with it, and what will the project effect be on adjacent marsh due to sea level rise, not just the project itself, but future sea level rise. Potentially considered, increasing in the coastal flood areas the buffer zone, so that you could look at more holistically the wetlands effects. You have two sections, 20 and 24, in your wetlands regulations that have some disagreeing, sort of contradictory things. maybe combine them into one section. Again, when you're talking about sea level rise and you ask somebody to submit a discussion about what it is the project going to do, I suggest that you choose a sea level rise curve or some way. Right now, you say that relying on a historic rate of 1 foot per 100 years. That's a little more than what has been to date. Historically, it's been less than that. So going forward, if you are saying that you want to use the high curve, the middle curve, the low curve, choose a curve. Make that your performance standard so that any applicant knows what they are going to be judged against. And it also makes it easier for you to permit because you know what to look for. There are prohibitions currently on impermeable surfaces in the flood zone. That's okay, and I understand the intent, but remember, you, the town, may need to be doing some of these projects. Think of either exceptions or ways that make sense. If you're going to widen a road or raise a road, would you be disqualifying yourself? And so just understand that. The current language only permits expansion of coastal engineering structures that are loose and slope stone, basically, the stone revetment type designs. Okay, and except what happens if you want to use berms? What happens if you want to use flood walls, and so on? Again, you want to start thinking. People are going to, whether it's you yourselves as the applicant, your DPW when they come for a project, or other homeowners and commercial developments will need to be looking at these things. So let's think about how to put those in as performance. Consider temporary barriers. Temporary barriers can be a very good solution, but you may have to put them temporarily on a coastal wetlands resource. Are you going to permit that or not? On a temporary basis. So, and then things like cleaning them off. They may be contaminated with, if there's oil that slipped in and you just hose them off in the wetland. Is that what you want? I don't know. So just and then clarify the definitions of expansion of existing structures. Abby tells me that has sometimes been a little bit of a sticking point, as who defines what is an expansion. So. Under the zoning bylaws, consider Oak Bluffs has a very good floodplain protection bylaw, and you may want to look at something similar or very codifying it a little bit better. I think you want to keep the FEMA firm basis because that basically by adopting the FEMA firm flood maps that sets that you're eligible for flood insurance, the town and such. So you don't want to probably mess with that, but you might want to have additional protection from the 1%, which is the standard, to the 500.2% flood level. Add some performance standards for wet and dry flood proofing of commercial facilities, because a lot of commercial facilities are going to be faced with, how do I protect myself? So, having some standards for, allowing water to come into a building in terms of materials, in terms of pumps, in terms of so on. Again, temporary flood barriers. Clearly define what's prohibited, what's allowable, and what's permissible by special permit. I think that's very important. Again, so you help to, and I would guess that a lot of things will be by special permit, as typically is the case, but you just want to try to minimize how many things are not being considered. Another thing is to possibly amend your bylaw to consider incentives, because one of the goals is for commercial and residential property owners, this doesn't affect you so much, as the municipality itself. But when you're looking at homeowners, you want them to raise and get out of the floodplain if possible. If you look at the idea of one thing, you have a height restriction in your zoning bylaw today. So if you have a house that's at that or just below it, and now you say, I want to raise it 5 feet or 8 feet to get it up above the freeboard, above the flood elevation, now all of a sudden I could be exceeding that height restriction. So the idea here is to allow for, maybe in the flood districts, to allow for height relief for that by right. Also, the town of Hull has an interesting, where when you have certain things that you want to do when you raise a structure, and you have what's called freeboard. So if the base elevation is at 10 and you want to have some additional space to encourage more building, if possible, to get it a little bit higher, Hull does an incentive program. It's not much, but where they reduce a permit fee by $500 if you raise an additional 2 feet of freeboard. And talking with Hull, they say that people have actually done that. So again, it's not a big thing. You can have different incentives, but another idea is cluster zoning, where in other words, if somebody has a development that is a subdivision that's going to be placed along a coastal barrier, a coastal floodplain, that if you can have it so that you cluster the homes away from the resource area, allow that to expand. Again, probably not a huge impact here, but nevertheless, that's one. And then that usually there's some kind of a density bonus to sort of do that, and it just minimizes the encroachment on open space. Oops, wrong way. Again, looking at potential land acquisition, you have your Open Space Acquisition Committee. We'll be looking to update the open space and recreation plan, I think, starting next year. So that's, looking at some of these areas that are somewhat critical, maybe that makes sense to start looking at some properties that may be candidates. The other thing that there's the concept of a rolling easement of some sort, where a lot of homeowners today would, they've had the home, and this was particularly, say, in places like Scituate, where there are a lot of vacation homes, and they've been in families forever, and you end up getting an easement on the house today, and you pay the homeowner, but with the proviso that when that storm gets damaged, there's no more rebuilding that home. So at that point, basically the town would take over. The owner gets a little bit of money today, so that they're being compensated for that lost value in the future. The details of that but that's a concept. And you've had in your hazard mitigation plan, there are 7 properties that are identified. I don't know which ones they are, but 7 repetitive loss properties in the town, with 2 or more flood claims in a 10-year period. So these might be the kind of properties that obviously are going to have more repetitive, unless they've raised structures or done some other adaptive design. Chances are those same 7 properties are going to start seeing more problems in the future. So if you're thinking of some kind of an easement or a buyout type program, acquisition program, then depending on where those particular properties are, that might be a consideration. And certainly having some policies that require that all town-funded projects certainly take into account sea level rise in the future. Abby suggested looking at the costs and benefits of becoming a green community. I know in Duxbury we looked at it and we decided not to do it. Certainly, as you look at your hazard mitigation plan, there's some more data now that I think can be applied to your hazard mitigation plan. Look at your snow storage policies down at the bathing beach, and perhaps do a report, whether it's annual or biennial, of resiliency actions being taken by not only you, but other sectors of the community. And last is a developing a coastal flood operations plan. And that's really an emergency plan. You probably do that to some extent now, but especially if you start having devices and things that will need to be deployed in case of a flood, you'd be surprised how it's important to define the actions to be taken, who's going to do them, who's responsible, and that they should be based on predicted water elevations, not just some information from the Weather Center. And that's it. So it's a lot of stuff. Hopefully it helps understand a little bit about sea level rise and climate change in the future. And I'd like to thank Abby and the whole steering committee for having us work on this project, and it was a very fun time. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Andre. I know we have a lot of hearing items, and there are some folks in the audience who are here for the next part of our meeting. And I know the planning board just went back upstairs to talk about, to continue on with their meeting. But please, if you have questions or comments, I'll defer to the Conservation Commission if you wanted to take any of them now. Otherwise, we'll move on to the next part of our meeting. This information, this presentation will be available as well as the report on the town's website. If you go to the Town of Hingham under Departments Conservation Commission, we have a whole page dedicated to this project. If you have questions or need more information and you want to email me, you can do that at conservation@hingham-ma.gov, and folks can certainly get in touch with us that way. And we'll certainly pass questions on, and we can ask questions of Andre and keep going. So thank you.
Not 2 meters, no. Oh, 2,100. No, we didn't do anything for 20. The question was, was there any 2 meter increase in 2,100? No, we didn't. No.
Changes in the bylaws and stuff.
Andre, you're talking about increasing the buffer zone. You've done some great work on height. Would it not make sense if you were changing the wetlands bylaws or even zoning to go away from horizontal distances and relate to vertical distances? So instead of a 200-foot setback from rivers, why isn't it something at 11.2 feet, which would give you a foot above the 10.2 or something?
Buzz's question was, instead of looking at horizontal setbacks for buffer zones of 100, 200, whatever distance, would it make more sense to investigate looking at it on a vertical in relation to sea level rise? Yes, it could. Absolutely. Yeah. Always think.
It's a good question. Yeah, no, great.